Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Neeraj Sood. I'm a professor of public policy at the Price School at USC and also a senior fellow at the USC Schaeffer Center. Today, we will be talking about antimicrobial resistance. Antimicrobial resistance has been named by the WHO as one of the top 10 public health threats facing the world. And what I mean by antimicrobial resistance is new infections that are resistant to antimicrobial agents or basically antibiotics. So these are infections that cannot be treated with the current set of antibiotics or other agents we might have. And there are two broad approaches to dealing with this problem. One is to come up with new antimicrobial agents or new antibiotics that can treat these infections. And the second is to curtail the use of current antibiotics so that they are more likely to be effective for a longer period of time. We will be focusing today on the first topic, which is how can we get more antibiotics in the pipeline that can treat infections that are resistant to current antibiotics. We have an excellent panel of experts today. Our first panelist is Dr. Jenny Cantor. She's a non-resident fellow at the USC Schaeffer Center and also a professor at University of Pennsylvania. Our second panelist is Dr. Brad Spellberg. He's the Chief Medical Officer at Los Angeles County and USC Medical Center. His research focuses on immunology, and he has actually done work on highly resistant bacterial and fungal infections. And our last panelist is Dr. Henry Skinner. Henry is the CEO of the AMR Action Fund, which is a large collaborative venture investing in new antibiotics. So I want to start the discussion by posing a question to Brad. Brad, I know you've written a book called The Rising Plague, which was meant to educate the public about the threat of antibiotic-resistant infections. So Brad, could you tell us a little bit about how big this problem is and how did we get here?
Sure. And maybe a little bit of the history, as you say, how we got here. So I think one of the challenges that people find confusing is antibiotic resistance is not like a COVID tidal wave that hits you in a year or two, and you put all resources in the world into it to get over it. Antibiotic resistance has been around since antibiotics were invented, and we didn't invent them. Bacteria did. And genetic analysis suggests they did that 2 to 2.5 billion years ago, which means microbes have been inventing and defeating antibiotics for 20 million times longer than we've known these drugs exist. There is already resistance in nature to drugs we have not invented yet. Pre-existing genetic mechanisms. And all that's going to happen when we start using the new gorillacillin or tyrannosauromycin is we're going to select out for that pre-existing resistance. It's going to catch up. So what that means is this is a sustainability problem. 500 years from now, we're going to have the same problem. 1,000 years from now, we're going to have the same problem, but we keep treating it like a moonshot problem. If we just put $10 billion into it today, it'll be solved, and that is not the case. In fact, things are actually better today than they were 15 years ago. 20 years ago, MRSA exploded into the community. It was never a community pathogen until the late 1990s. Carbapenem resistance emerged in Pseudomonas and Acinetobacter and Klebsiella. That all happened in the late 90s and early 2000s. And that's when the pipeline collapsed for the third time, believe it or not. It collapsed. It had previously collapsed before and then recovered and then collapsed again. We keep cycling through history. So where we are today is actually in 2004, there were 6 antibiotics in the pipeline. And there were 7 bladder hyperactivity drugs. That tells you where the priorities were. Today, the Pew Charitable Trust says there's 42 antibiotics in the pipeline, and yet people keep complaining that the pipeline is dead. It's actually 7-fold more rich today than it was 15 to 20 years ago. Pre-pandemic, CDC published a very nice comprehensive paper from the United States showing that for most resistant pathogens, resistance rates had fallen and were actively declining. The only exception to that was ESBLs. Everything else was declining. Now, COVID has thrown a wrench into that. But so my point is this. Right now, we're in this interesting period between disaster, 10 years ago and disaster 10 years from now. And this is the moment where, in my mind, we should be rethinking a sustainable solution to this problem rather than simply throwing money at the problem as we have done in the past, thinking that's going to buy us more than 5 or 10 years.
Brad, thank you for those comments. So the way I heard it is you're saying we should not be having this webinar on this topic. And I want to give the floor to Henry.
Well, that's not what I was trying to say.
Okay.
What I was trying to say is that what we should be thinking about are long-term sustainable solutions, not short-term moonshot solutions.
Yes. And so I just want to give Henry and Jenny the chance to respond to this.
Yeah, thanks. No, I think Brad's right. I mean, we've made some great improvements over the years with infection prevention, with stewardship initiatives that have, to some extent, corralled the problem. Never going to get rid of it, as Brad said. Resistance predates antibiotics, and we will fight that battle in perpetuity. So we do need the right armamentarium to give physicians the right antibiotic to give to each patient who has a particular infection at a moment of time. And that requires a number of things, right? One is to have antibiotics available as resistance emerges and is maintained. And we need to think of that globally. We've made great headways in the US, although during COVID, we slipped backwards, and we need to get back on the right track there. But we do need something sustainable. If we think about antibiotic R&D, it takes north of 10 years to develop a new antibiotic, right? To decide what the target is, to then develop it, do your safety studies preclinically, to demonstrate that it does what you want it to do clinically, which has its own challenges. If we think about those clinical studies. But then to have additional, ideally, modalities and approaches that are complementary and not incremental, but actually directly address the greatest threats of resistance. And that's going to take something sustainable. Right now, right, we're in a lull, notwithstanding the 42 or 37 drugs in the pipeline. Many of those aren't moving. Most of them really are not what I would characterize as meaningful breakthrough antibiotics that are going to dramatically address the challenge. They're either quite incremental or frankly, aren't addressing it at all. Some of those are new acne antibiotics, which, let's put those in a different category, right? We're not talking the life-threatening infections. And the market's broken. The amount of capital going into anti-infective, or at least antibiotic R&D, is less than 3% of what's going into oncology. It has been flat at about $200 million for about 15 years, notwithstanding inflation, while oncology research has just gone, exponentially through the roof. So we're not resourcing R&D here. That pipeline, I think, looks richer than it is if you look at the quality and how those things are moving forward. And we need the anticipation of where to go. We need to do a better job on surveillance and really understanding the emerging mechanisms, because we need to give R&D and entrepreneurs, 10 or 15 year guidance as to where that target should be. And we need to capitalize that R&D in an effective way. That's broken right now. We don't have investment into this. We've got a number of what we call push incentives, groups like Carbex, and other just fundamentally great endeavors to try to move research out of academia into drug discovery. And then it's getting to the clinic where it really is struggling enormously, and we just don't have enough effectively moving through, let alone what happens if they make it through and take all that risk successfully, get it to the FDA, get approval for an indication, the challenge of then expanding the utility with clinical data into other indications is insurmountable. Many companies have now either gone bankrupt after they got through approval, or they've been bought for pennies on the dollar, and we've not been able to deliver these drugs broadly and provide the access to patients that are needed. And that's certainly true around the world if we think of the challenges in the low and middle income countries. But even in the wealthy countries, we're not providing access to the few drugs we are getting out. Only 2 of the last 17 approved antibiotics in the United States have been approved in Canada, just to show that the challenge here. And we really need a holistic solution here. But some of those solutions are being played out, right? We have some experimentation. The United Kingdom has started a subscription model to help try to incent innovation and financing into this space, where they've said, if you develop a new antibiotic that has the properties we want, then we will guarantee you a reimbursement. We will purchase the right to use that antibiotic for the English healthcare system for a fixed sum. And whether we use a lot of it or a little bit of it, there's a guaranteed payment. And if we do that broadly around the world, in aggregate, there should be enough reward, if you will, financial return on investment into antibiotic R&D to then bring forward the types of antibiotics we need. Now, that has to be done carefully. We need to have the right criteria. We don't want incrementalism. We want really breakthrough antibiotics. That should be doable. And if we do this in a way that is lasting and drawn out, we should be able to have a steady cadence of important new antibiotics available so that they can put into the armamentarium, used by physicians appropriately and judiciously in the right setting, and keep on top of, or at least minimize the challenge of AMR.
So, Jenny, I'm curious if you have thoughts on whether the current system we have for incentivizing innovation, is that working for a new generation of antibiotics, or like what is the fundamental problem here? Why doesn't it work for new antibiotics, but say it works great for oncology?
Right. Great question. And the short answer is antibiotics are just not very profitable. Okay. So that's always the bottom line. But sort of the longer answer is to put things into context. For a typical drug, the main incentive for companies to develop new drugs and face a lot of risk of failure is the revenue they receive from being the exclusive seller of the drug they develop. So they get the exclusivity because they get the patent for the innovative drug. And if the drug meets a clinical need and you're the only one selling it, you can choose your price and you're on easy street. So, but with antibiotics, it's a different story, because even though they do meet a clinical need, they lose their clinical value over time. As Brad explained, antibiotics eventually become ineffective because the treatment itself selects for the bacteria that survive treatment, that are resistant. And so really for antibiotics, the biggest value is actually when it first comes out and kills everything in sight. So if you were a drug company, you're thinking, oh, well, to get the most revenue, I want to charge a high price and treat as many people as possible. But then it sort of interacts with some other things going on, some other social clinical guidelines. If you're the only drug that can treat infections that are multi-drug resistant, then physicians, trained appropriately, don't want to use it willy-nilly because they don't want to hasten resistance to it. So what they do with antibiotic stewardship is they reserve the best drugs for treating the multi-drug resistant strains that no other drugs can treat. So the demand itself is low initially, for these reasons. And I would say a third reason is that, and this is something that Henry alluded to, some of the biggest problems with communicable diseases and with antibiotic resistance are in low-income countries. So there are both market and political pressures to keep the prices of antibiotics low, sort of similar to the reasons vaccines are also not very profitable. So ultimately, I guess the bottom line to that long answer is when a firm is deciding where to invest to get the greatest expected returns, it's often not in antibiotics as opposed to other drug classes.
Thank you, Jenny. So I think what you're saying is that, look, for these new antibiotics to be really effective, they have to be on the shelf most of the time and used kind of sparingly, because if you start using them a lot, then the bugs will develop resistance to it. And therefore, we need to do something different than just providing patents or exclusivity to encourage innovation. So Henry, now coming back to you, you talked about the subscription model in the UK. What are some other proposals or policy solutions to accelerate innovation in this new generation of antibiotics?
I think there's been a couple proposed in Europe. There's also talk of a transferable exclusivity voucher. It's another way of providing some financial reward for innovation, a different model. I think the most consistent model, and probably that which is most exciting, is the subscription model. There's a number of pluses to it. One, it guarantees access, right? If you have a subscription, you only pay that out if that country or region has access to the antibiotic. So that's a very nice coupling. In the US, there's an act that's been proposed in this Congress in 2021 called the Pasteur Act. That is a subscription model, has some other aspects to it that is attractive, an enhancement of stewardship beyond where it is in the United States. It has some aspects of trying to get government agencies to cooperate and the like. But the bigger part of it is setting up HHS to decide and define a set of criteria for what new antibiotics are worthy of reimbursement, if you will, under that schema. And then to provide somewhere between 75 million a year and 300 million a year, depending on the quality and impact in public health that antibiotic might have for a period of up to 10 years. So really setting the mark, if you will, of what is desired, what the public health need is, and trying to direct innovation to fill those needs directly in a way that provides the United States access to those medicines, directs it to the right place, and in a sliding scale, will recognize the value of a particular antibiotic brought to market and proven with clinical data. There are some other things in the U.S. that have been proposed, the Disarm Act in the previous Congress that addresses some other issues with antibiotics. We've got challenges in the hospital setting around capitation and DRGs that needs a bit of attention. But I think most of those, while beneficial, are marginal to the fundamental problem that if you need to spend $500 million getting an antibiotic to the marketplace, there has to be a return on that investment or investors won't come in. Now, some of that's been made up in pull incentives or push incentives, much of which is government supported, and that may diminish it. But nevertheless, these are risky, expensive endeavors that there needs to be some promise of financial return if we expect investment into the space, not only of investors, but frankly, the other concern I have is that the scientific capability, our entrepreneurs, our microbiologists and chemists who've been in this space, with bankruptcies and other things, have been leaving the space. And so we're losing our capability to innovate in the space the longer that this goes on.
Thank you, Henry. Brad, I want to come back to you on your comments in the opening remarks, where you said that maybe what we don't need here is a moonshot, but a more sustainable solution. So, Brad, if you were in charge, how would you, approach this problem? What would you do and why?
In 1965, there was a roundtable of several Nobel Prize winners and other extremely famous scientists in the ID and microbiology space who wrote a position paper decrying the collapse of the antibiotic pipeline and declaring that there was a need to figure out how to develop new gram-negative drugs for fungi, and drugs for viruses. Does that sound familiar to you? That was 50 years ago. Nobody remembers it, and it's the same problem we have today. Here's the reality. I was the guy who pushed for the push incentives. I was the guy who testified before Congress to get GAIN passed. The capital market is broken. Right? If we are capitalists, we need to admit that. Maybe we should stop arguing with the capital markets and start acknowledging what the capital markets are telling us. The fundamental problem of the market is that it's a commodities market for antibiotics. There's 90 or 100 antibiotics already on the market, and every new one that's approved competes with all of those drugs that are already on the market and then becomes competition for the next one to come along. And that is a downward death spiral. It will never get better. Everything that gets approved will always be competition for future drugs. So after reading that roundtable paper that a colleague sent me in 2012, was the first time I saw it, it began to dawn on me that what I think really need is to move to a nonprofit model. That is not to say to fully replace for-profit, but the for-profit space is going to be much more limited in scope. It's just the monetary fact. And what we need are nonprofits that recreate the old pharma model. See, I was on the standing anti-infective advisory boards for Pfizer and Glaxo for years. When you put 50 people together, and 10 of them are microbiologists and 10 of them are med chem, and you got 5 animal testing experts, and you got your regulatory experts, and you have teams that know how to do this, they are much more effective at not only identifying lead candidates, but in sifting them to determine, yeah, that might be nice in the future, but there's tox this, there's going to be med chem problems that. We've lost that. And what I'd like to see are endowed nonprofits that bring those teams back together, live off an endowment that is self-renewing, use the existing push incentives to bring lead products into the bullpen. I call it in the bullpen. And then they can either use existing incentives at BARDA and NIAID to actually pay for the clinical trials, or at a late stage of development, out-license or sell to a much smaller footprint of for-profit capital market that can actually then bring the product to market. And you've de-risked the molecule, you've shortened the time to development, so your net present value calculation isn't getting killed by discounting for 10 years. I think that's the future. And it's not because people have said, well, you're just anti-capitalist. Not at all. If you're, it's like if you call for subsidies, that feels more anti-capitalist. To me, the for-profit model helps to sustain a more limited, viable capital marketplace in the future. And it's not because I'm against pharma. I'm not. It's just I don't think we can make for-profit work in this space, not in the long run.
So, Brad, is your point that for-profits doesn't work because they don't have the incentive to do R&D, or is it that for-profits don't work because once a drug is on the market, it leads to overuse of the drug because they're competing with 10 other drugs, and that makes the drug less effective?
No, it's that you can't make enough money selling these drugs to make them desirable for pharma to say, yeah, I'm going to invest in that instead of a cancer drug or a rheumatology drug.
But then what's wrong with the pull incentives? That in the sense you're right that you're addressing the problem that pharma doesn't have enough incentives to invest in these drugs, and there are these proposals to increase those incentives to invest in these drugs. Why have a kind of a separate setup or a nonprofit entity to do this without that discipline, the market discipline?
No, the nonprofit would have market discipline because nobody would use the drug if they developed a drug that nobody needs. And again, the goal would be to either leverage existing push incentives to bring to market or to sell or out license to for-profit. Here's the problem with, I'm a taxpayer. We're $31 trillion in debt. There's no end to this. See, if you said, look, let's put $10 billion into it and we've solved it, it's a moonshot. Okay. That's not going to happen. You're going to have the same conversation 10 years. You're going to need another $10 billion and then another 10. There's no end to it. You've created an artificial fake market. We essentially, what we will have done is created farm incentives, farm subsidies, except these aren't farmers. They're pharma companies and VC-backed biotech that's laden with cash. And remember, part of the problem you have in this space is you made $1 billion this year. Congratulations. You better make 1.1 billion next year. It's not just about the total dollar amount. You need 10% annual growth. That's not going to happen for an antibiotic. Now let's talk about the subscription model just briefly. Here's my problem with the subscription model. Several states in the United States have used the subscription model for Hep C drugs. The reason being, you want everyone treated for Hep C to limit the transmission to others, and the drugs are very expensive. This is the Netflix model. I'm going to pay you a flat rate, but because I've paid you that rate, I can use as much as I want. And the more I use, the better value to the customer, that is the taxpayer. In the subscription model in the Pasteur Act, it's flipped around. The money is fixed, but you're going to be disincentivized. You want to use less. So this would be like Netflix, except you don't watch Netflix and you're still paying the Netflix fees. If the customer is pharma, that's a great deal. If the customer is the taxpayer, I'm like, I think there is a more efficient way, which is for $1 billion, I could set up 3 endowed nonprofits that will sustainably do this R&D. So to me, it's just, as a taxpayer, it just doesn't feel right.
So Jenny and Henry, if you want to comment on Brad's proposal or have your own view of what you would do if you were in charge.
I'll have Henry start first because I suspect he's on the other extreme of the spectrum, and then I'll sort of try to split the baby somehow.
Thanks, Jenny. Well, I think we agree there needs to be innovation. We need to incent that innovation or finance it one way or the other. There's lots of approaches to that. The push incentives have helped on the early side. But I think there's a number of things that I think we need to think through. So we definitely need the capability. If we think about innovation in healthcare, it is largely 80+% driven by small, innovative biotechnology companies. And that's across healthcare, be it medtech, pharmaceutical, or otherwise, right? The system we have of small biotechs getting started, of taking great ideas out of academia, of translating them into the clinic and ultimately identifying the patient benefit has served us enormously well over the past 3 decades. We've made enormous headways in multiple need areas, to dramatic effect, be that melanoma. We've seen some promising work coming out of Alzheimer's, MS, orphan diseases, et cetera. That planting of 1,000 seeds and having the market finance it and double down on those that look promising and bringing together management teams and providing that oversight, to me, has been incredibly effective as a system. And I'm very attracted to leveraging that expertise across that continuum and finding a way to incent it. And then identifying, and this is, I think, the key thing to me, where I think Brad and I would agree violently, is, we don't need 100 new antibiotics that are really undifferentiated. We need a handful of very differentiated, meaningful things that address the greatest need. And if we hold true to that, then I think this can work. And I don't think it's 10 billion a year, right? Maybe it's $1 billion a year, but there's a huge public health cost to AMR that goes out forever. If we think about penicillin and the life expectancy in the 1920s and 30s, and where it went to after the government sparked the creative ability of people with a Manhattan-like project in World War II to figure out how to make penicillin so that we would have it available to soldiers as they stormed Normandy and then commercialized. I mean, frankly, the antibiotic golden era, right, in the 40s and 50s, built the pharma industry, right? This was the most transformative class of drugs to provide the greatest human health benefit. And we've been slowly eroding that since the 80s and just, incrementally less effective. So first principles, I think we agree on kind of the macro side of it. Then the question is, what is the most efficient way to get that productivity? And I think that's to reward success in a way and to define what that success is meaningfully, rather than in a broad way that funds or rewards incrementalism. I think that is not something that is sustainable or that actually translates the value that's needed. But if we hold to the meaningful things and reward that and let the system do what it does best, right? Cull bad ideas, double down on good ones, drive efficiency, and allow people to reward it for that, I think we'll have the greatest success and really leverage our fundamental approach to innovation.
I don't quite agree that we need to overthrow the system, but I'm sympathetic with what Brad is saying, because I think, although I might frame it a little differently, which is that we have and we will always have under innovation when the social value of a service or product exceeds the private value of a service or product, which is exactly the case here. There are many social benefits in the form of deaths averted, hospital expenditures averted, life years extended from preventing the spread of a communicable disease. And those exceed the possibly small returns to the firms of development. And what that means, if I just take my econ off the shelf, what it means is there's space when there's this wedge between social and private value, there's space for, it is a market failure. So I think I would agree with Brad on that end. And so there are aspects of the market that are not doing a great job with what we want. Now, the traditional econ story says, oh, well, that's space for government intervention. And so then we trot out, not to be glib, I don't mean to be glib about that, but we have a lot of incentives, different kinds of incentives, push incentives, pull incentives that are brought out. Primarily the focus in legislation, in like the Pasteur Act and in implemented programs is on these advanced market commitments or the subscription models where there is some fixed payment to sort of reduce the risk for firms. Now, I think, my view of those is they're a great, interesting idea, but I think the empirical evaluations of some sort of one of the biggest sort of advanced market commitment programs, the pneumococcal vaccine, has shown actually that it actually is not, well, there are a couple of problems with these kind of pull incentives where you reward sort of the winners, post-market. And one is that, it's oftentimes the timeline too distant to be really effective. It's not a strong, it's not a high-powered incentive. And in the pneumococcal vaccine advanced market commitment program, they did not see an increase in R&D in the number of vaccines that came out of that. They saw a number of other things like, speedier, speed to market, improved, but not actual number of vaccines. Secondly, when you have these pull incentives, they're because it's so distant from the drug in development, much, much larger subsidies are required. And that, I think, also goes to Brad's point, which is those kinds of subsidies are not sustainable when we have essentially just a cyclical problem. There's a fundamental systemic problem about the way we use antibiotics and how scientifically, how resistance emerges. And finally, and I think we also get to this, the optics are terrible, right? Of government subsidizing profit-making companies. And I think that makes, although, the Pasteur Act is, on its way, but I think that makes it really difficult for the typical taxpayer, the typical, person on the street concerned about these things. And so I think the pull incentives, to my mind, if I had to come down, one side or the other, I think incentives are important and there will always be underinvestment. And so there's room for additional other incentives from other sources, like the government, like philanthropic sources. But let's think about, how effective are these incentives? And if I had to come down on one side or the other, the pull incentives seem really big, really expensive, really unsustainable to be, to do what we wanted to do. I would probably throw all that money that would have gone in there to the push incentives, because what we really need is sort of this virtuous cycle of scientific innovation, of new targets, of really, thinking about the science and innovating on the basic science itself. So if I had to make my bets, it would be on the push incentives, but just a lot more money than we've been putting in that direction.
But Jenny, just to kind of counteract a little, that if we just do push incentives, so suppose it takes $1 billion to come up with a new antibiotic and you subsidize it through push incentives, say by 20% or 30%, you still have a problem that at the end, your drug still doesn't have a market. So you're still going to lose money without the pull incentives, right? That ultimately you want your drug to make money. Otherwise, you've reduced the R&D cost, but there's still no market for the drug, especially if you want to use this drug sparingly and only if there is a super bug that shows up. So I'm just curious.
Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. I guess two thoughts related to that. One is that, so I'll make enemies of both of my co-panelists, but one is that, the stewardship bearing in mind that this is a dynamic problem that is just fundamentally driven by just science and how bacteria behave, stewardship can only slow things down. It doesn't really solve the problem, and we need sort of a cyclical way of thinking about it. So to be honest, I'm not. I guess maybe not so fussed about stewardship. The second part is that in the early stages, extremely risky, unprofitable. When we get to late stage commercialization, I mean, the fact that we have the AMR Action Fund and investors coming in tells us that there is some margin of profitability there. Maybe it's not like, huge margins, like maybe Bitcoin these days, or, but there are some margins there, especially for firms or investors who have more ESG or social impact priorities. So, I haven't lost hope for the incentive for, private actors, but I do think we could, given that there's a wedge here between private and social, there is room for the government to act. We just have to be very, thoughtful about how and where the government should act with its limited resources.
So I'm going to now switch to some questions from the audience. So the first question is that it seems like the best way to avoid overprescribing antibiotics starts and ends with the prescribing physician. And it notes that we've made great efforts to educate patients about when antibiotics are necessary, but what really prevents the physician from prescribing antibiotics inappropriately? And so what are your thoughts on how can we get physicians to change their behavior?
I will tackle that. But I actually, before I do, I just want to comment. I think that Jenny and Niraj, you both laid out the reason why nonprofits are needed. Not to eliminate a for-profit market, but to make a much smaller capital footprint sustainable. The fact is, if you are able to bring a drug to market that's only going to sell $15, $20, $25 million per year, that's a massive win for a nonprofit. It's never going to be accepted by big pharma. Small biotechs will accept it for a year or two and then get bought out. So the sheer dollar amounts available on sales are just not going to be sustainable for a large for-profit marketplace. But nonprofits can do that work. And pharma has actually done this via nonprofits. We've had new TB drugs through the TB Alliance. Nobody makes money selling those drugs, but they've brought them to market and they're saving lives. And pharma's done it because it was the right thing to do. And that's why the TB Alliance was set up. And the same is true with the Alliance for Malaria. So this can be done. Now, to your question, this is a question I get asked all the time, right? And the answer is very simple. This is not a knowledge deficit. Everybody wants to treat, we just need to educate, doc. No, has nothing. The doctor, let me give you a scenario that comes. I'm on stewardship right now. I ran it on stewardship immediately before this call. Let me give you a scenario that comes up all the time on stewardship. Okay, you get called by the intern or resident, and you say, they say, I need a cefepime which is a very broad spectrum antibiotic because my patient has gram-negative bacteria in the urine. And you say, but does the patient have any symptoms? No, they have any symptoms, but there's gram-negatives in the urine, so I need the cefepime. And you go, well, that's asymptomatic bacteriuria. We don't treat that. No, I know, but there's gram-negatives in the urine, so I need the antibiotic. If they were taking a board exam, they get the question right. They're not taking a board exam. They're taking care of a sick human being, and they're scared, and they don't know what to do. Okay, so this is about fear. Fear drives inappropriate prescriptions by far more than lack of knowledge. And we have treated this like a knowledge problem, and that's why we've been very unsuccessful largely at stewardship. As we become better at the psychological interventions of convincing people or creating market forces the other direction, that will lead us to much more effective stewardship options. And there's literature on how to do that.
So the second question from the audience is, why doesn't the government create a pharma company to do R&D in this space? So maybe Brad, this is similar to your idea of having a nonprofit do it.
It's not quite the same. I don't think government can do it. That is a communism model. Okay. But what government can do is set up nonprofits that are 501c3s, that are nonprofit companies. I mean, hospitals are nonprofits. They're not run by the government. They're private entities. They hire talent and they undergo the same market forces that for-profit companies do. What I'd like to see are independent nonprofits set up to do this work, living off an endowment.
Another question from the audience is that why don't we use priority review vouchers as a pull incentive? So that would basically be you get a voucher and you're first in the queue to get reviewed by the FDA, and you can sell the voucher to anyone you would like in the market. So maybe Henry?
Yeah, priority review vouchers are a form of a market entry reward. There's other similar things. I think there's a number of things they don't do well. So what they do well is they provide some cash or a reward at the time that you've reached approval. But once that's been handed out, there's no guarantee of access. And one of the things talked about is, well, if you have 20 million of revenue from an antibiotic, that's great. The problem is it might cost you 30 million a year, right, to get that 20 million of revenue. And this has been the problem. It's not so simple as all the expense is done when you're in research and development. There's a lot of expense to commercialize, from manufacturing and pharmacovigilance and med affairs, and frankly, wanting or needing to do additional clinical studies. So if you start in CUTI, you ought to be in HAP-VAP. Maybe that's where the drug's needed most. So you have another study to do. You have pediatric studies to do. All of these things are expensive. So even a nonprofit has to make a profit or it goes out of existence, right? You need to minimally break even. The only difference is you don't send money to shareholders, but you need to keep the lights on. And so your cash flow out needs to match your cash flow in, or you cease to exist. And this is part of the broken market. It costs too much, right, for a 8 or 10 or 15 or $20 million a year antibiotic to be sustainable on its own, period. So, to me, these market entry vouchers, they're just a moment in time. There needs to be something that is sustainable, that provides some window of income or revenue to make that antibiotic available, to keep it on, and to ensure that it's on the market and that someone doesn't take that reward, pocket it, and leave. And that certainly does no patient benefit.
There already are priority review vouchers as part of GAIN. I think that part of the issue is, as has been said, government has demonstrated it is not capable of targeting these incentives properly. There needs to be an independent targeting board set up because people who don't practice medicine don't actually know what we actually need in the moment in the hospital. And I obviously, Henry and I are not in alignment on the inability of nonprofits to break even, because I think they definitely could. In fact, there are already some that exist that do.
Well, I'm not saying that they can't. I'm just saying let's not simplify the challenge. And if you get some revenue, then everything is good. And that's putting aside the development. I think there's room for lots of solutions here, but it's not inexpensive to keep an antibiotic on the market, even just in the US. And let's face it, this is a much bigger problem than US. It's a much bigger problem in other parts of the world. And if we need to think about this as a one, world health problem, we know the world is small. Resistance does travel. And so the problem extends well beyond our borders. And frankly, the solution should as well, right? These antibiotics are needed. And for us to control AMR, we need holistic solutions that are global.
So we're out of time. Thank you all for joining us. And thank you to the panelists for a lively and interesting discussion. And as you can see, the discussion will probably continue after the webinar. But thank you so much.